This is John Lauder, host of The Cheap Seats. Thanks for listening to the following broadcast on Public House Media.
This is Bryce Burge, host of Your Soccer Passport here on Public House Media. After this episode, come join us on a trip around the soccer world as we discuss club and country every Tuesday. Stamp your soccer passport by subscribing on Spotify, iTunes, or wherever you get your Public House Media podcasts. And thanks again for checking out the following broadcast on Public House Media.
Welcome to How to Write Good. I'm your host, Daniel Poppy. You can find out more about me at danielpoppy.com. Poppy is spelled P-O-P-P-I-E. If you haven't checked out my book, you should go there and check it out. You can get it on Amazon, so you can also check it out there. But you should really go to my website if you're interested in the book, because it'll show you everything else I'm doing as well. This podcast is brought to you by Public House Media. If you want to follow this podcast at all, like if you're interested in following it on social media, even though I do put stuff on social media, I hate social media, honestly. I'm really, really sorry. I dislike it a lot. So you can follow on social media: Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. Are there any more? Maybe. Are there any more social media? What do you call them? Sites? Social medias. Whatever. We'll just jump into our word of the week because we don't need to talk about social media anymore, or at all, actually. The word of the week is prosecute because it's fun to say. There's not really a reason. So the word of the week in the early 15th century, so that's the 1400s, it meant follow up or pursue a course of action. Okay, so you're doing something, you're going to prosecute something. It means you're going to follow or pursue some course of action. It comes from the Latin, I don't know, it's prosecutus. I think it's prosecutus or something like that, but whatever. It really doesn't matter because nobody speaks Latin anymore, unless you want to consider Spanish, French, and Italian a type of Latin. It means to follow after, accompany, chase, pursue, attack, assail, abuse, which sounds kind of like what you do today when you prosecute someone. So if you want to break it down, pro means forward, and sequi means follow, so follow forward, right? And now, if you're not aware of what it means to bring to a court of law. And the first time that was used was actually in like the 1570s. So the word prosecute is how we know it today, and what it means is it means, what do you call it? It means the exact same thing since the 1570s. But in English, in the 1530s, it meant go into detail, which I think is a really interesting history of that word. Now, it doesn't mean go into detail at all anymore. It means take to a court of law, or it means to not sue necessarily, but it means, I guess, sue in a court of law if you want to say it that way. The state suing you, I guess. But we are going to jump into our next rule of writing, and it is, what is it, the second, third? I don't even know what week it is of November. It's been going super quickly. Unbelievably fast. I don't even remember recording anything last week, and I swear to God I did. I'm pretty sure I did. So this week's, we are into the creative writing. For those of you, if you skipped last week or if it hasn't been a while, the first 5 rules are my writing rules in general, and then we're getting into the creative writing rules. Last week we had our first. You can go back and you can listen to that. I'm not going to talk about the other rules anymore. Those first 5 I wanted to get hammered into people's heads because I think they're really, really important. But these next ones I think are really for creative writers. And I think that if for someone who's a creative writer, if you listen to one of these, if you listen to it once, you'll be fine. Those other ones are just so important that I'm like, go back to those, always go back to those, always go back to those first rules. So this is week number 7 it's rule number 7. It's week number 7 where I'm talking about the rules. I'm going to be taking a break pretty soon to have my guests on for November, but at the end of the month, but it is week number 7. So this is one of my pet peeves, and I tried to separate myself from this pet peeve to talk about it. And my pet peeve is when people say I can't do something in writing. Okay, in writing, if you just do a quick Google search, because that's where we get all our information, which is a little scary if you think about it, because you could manipulate it however you want. But if you go and you look at different advice given by writers, now I'm a fan of some of the advice given by writers because it's all tongue-in-cheek. There's one writer who's like, oh, bring a pencil if you go on an airplane because then it doesn't leak, and it says, oh, have some whiskey and stuff like that. So it's very tongue-in-cheek and very funny. It's not meant to be serious at all, but maybe at the same time it's meant to convey some serious idea in relation to writing. But it seems like every writer has specific things they refuse to use or they tell you should not use from the English language. For example, just a few off the top. So this is a quote from Kurt Vonnegut. Here's a lesson in creative writing. First rule, do not use semicolons. They are transvestite hermaphrodites representing absolutely nothing. All they do is show you've been to college. So Kurt Vonnegut is essentially saying there's no use to semicolons. Forget about them. Don't use them in your stuff, right? Orwell says never use a figure of speech that you are used to seeing in print, and never use a long word where a short one will do. And I'm going to go back to these and talk a little bit about it in a little bit and what my objection is to each. And then what my objection is to this whole entire idea. And then I just looked up if you look up, words I shouldn't use in writing, you will find pretty much the exact same words to use in writing. So words that you should never use from the internet, because the internet is the source of all wisdom, and it is essentially a scripture, but it is, these are the words never to use. Really, you, feel, think, as, a lot, sort of, kind of, like, just, used to. And then Eleanor Leonard, and I've never read any of her books, but she is a big author. She said, never open a book with weather, avoid prologues, never use a verb other than said to carry dialogue, never use an adverb to modify a word, said. And I think that Mark Twain has the quote where he says, every time you want to use the word very in your writing, put the word damn instead. Can I say that? Every time you use that, put the word damn instead, and then your editor will take out the curse, right? So he even has, back in the 1800s, he has a rule for what you shouldn't put in your writing. Now, I want to go over these really quickly and talk about each of them, but at the same time, like, you don't have free license to do whatever you want with writing. There is structure to language, so you have to follow the structure to language, because if you don't follow the language structure, it's nonsense, right? If that makes sense. Language has an inherent logic and structure. Now, it isn't like formal logic, but it makes sense. It's put together in a very specific way, and if you decide, I'm going to do something different, either you have to do it in a way that actually follows the logic of the language so people can understand it, or you have to do it in a way that, or if you don't do it in that way, if you do not follow the logic of the language when you're doing something different than what the language asks, you have to make it logical and make it consistent enough so people can catch on eventually. But otherwise, it's going to be nonsensical, and then you're not going to be able to convey what you're trying to convey. So, Kurt Vonnegut has the opinion that semicolons are pointless. The semicolons are pointless. Now, some of you may agree with him. Some of you may be like, well, what is the point of a semicolon? Why would I ever use a semicolon? I had a teacher in high school who said you shouldn't use there should be like 2 semicolons in a book. And I found that semicolons convey something very subtle they're much different than a period. They're like a comma, but you can connect 2 things together. You can connect 2 ideas together in a way that you wouldn't otherwise with a period, right? It strings 2 ideas together. So in my opinion, or how I see it, or how I experience semicolons, they're very different. So I disagree with him on that level. Now, with this is a little different. If you see something in language or see something in grammar that is completely pointless, like it honestly has no point and there's no reason it's there, then I would say, okay, maybe we should take this out of the language, maybe we should take this out of the grammar. If semicolons, now I do experience a difference between a period and a semicolon. and a difference in meaning between the two. And because I experience a difference in meaning between the two, I think that they should be in language because each of them is conveying something different, even though one is a lot subtler than the other. When you have a semicolon and you put a semicolon in between two clauses, it means the clauses are connected in some way. They have the same idea connecting them. So if it was the case that the semicolon actually had no meaning whatsoever, it was just kind of there, I would say, okay, that makes sense, take it out. So that one's a little different than the rest. Now, George Orwell says never use a figure of speech. And why does he say this? And I'm going to get into the rule in a little bit, but I do want to go through why they say these things because I think it connects back to the rule. He says never use a figure of speech that you are used to seeing in print, and never use a long word where a short one will do. Natural language varies, right? There are certain figures of speech, there are cliches that people use in their regular lives when they're speaking, but it's generally the case that people can come up with a lot more to say than they can come up to write, if that makes sense. People have a lot easier time talking than writing, and you can see that by someone who is incapable of writing, but they can just talk forever. But the reason why I'm saying this is because in writing, writing is a little different. So if you speak something written out loud and you're writing, like I've said before, if you write, you should always say you should always read what you're working on out loud because it gives you the natural flow of the language. But in your head, you actually are reading it in a different way than you'd actually experience it if you were talking. All right. So if you are not reading your stuff out loud, you're experiencing it differently. And if you're reading it that way and you're coming across a figure of speech that's used over and over and over and over again, or that figure of speech eventually loses its meaning, right? People don't realize what's going on with a figure of speech. And I'm actually going to be addressing this in another rule. What rule is that? I'm actually going to be addressing this idea of figure of speech way down the line because I don't think it's that important. On rule number 11, so you can look forward to that. But the idea that he is trying to convey is that you are not you're trying to present something new to someone that is that they can understand and that they can see. What a figure of speech does is that it locks up, it kind of glosses over what's happening. There's certain words. I could say I communicated with my brother, right? You don't exactly know what that means. It's a kind of an ambiguous term. And a figure of speech, in a way, becomes an ambiguous term because people don't actually think about it. Now, if it was a new idea that was going to turn into a figure of speech, so if you say all hell broke loose, and it's the first time it's ever used in the world, then people are going to think, oh, wow, that's interesting. And they're going to think about that connection to hell breaking loose in relation to what's happening in the real world. Now, the second one actually goes along with this. So Orwell says never use a long word where a short one will do. And what he is trying to say is you're trying to connect your language back to actual speech, right? You're trying to have your language mimic actual speech. So if you use a long word, generally, a long word is not actually going to be natural speech. But there are certain short words that you could be like, oh, well, I know a word for elephant that is extremely short. It's 2 letters, which I don't think there is a word for elephant that's 2 letters. It's 2 letters. I'm going to use that instead. Well, that doesn't work because it actually doesn't mimic actual speech, right? Because nobody uses that word. Otherwise, we just use that word instead of the word elephant, which is a fairly long word. So what he's tried to, he goes too far with it. He says never use a long word where a short one will do. If he's going to make this, if he's going to use the logic of what he's talking about, he should say never use a word that isn't part of regular speech, where one that is part of regular speech will do. And he does leave the caveat out that you should only do it when there's no other option. So that is what he's trying to do. So he's actually trying to get back to regular speech, right? He's trying to get back to the meaning. The first rule is grammar serves meaning. He's trying to get back to the meaning in that first rule of never use a figure of speech. Always get back to what it means. And he's trying to get back to how language actually sounds. Now, what about all the banned words? Really, you, feel, think, as, a lot, sort of, kind of, like, just, used to, and stuff like that. These are actually words that don't mean much, and that's why they're banned. Some of them really is. I'm not going to say it becomes a lazy word. Okay, it becomes a lazy word, and really. It was really good, right? That doesn't really convey. I just used the word. I'm really bad at using the word really. It's a vocal tick. It's not a vocal tick, but it's just something I've gotten into the habit of, and I should probably get out of it. The word really. If it's really good, okay, what does that mean, right? It could be the case that it was really. If you went to a restaurant and you said it was really good, it could mean many things. You could say the atmosphere was excellent, right? You could say that the food was excellent. You could say that you just had a really good time with your friends. Okay, and I use the word really, and I'm going to be noticing it. So that's one of them. Another word is feel. Now, if you say, I feel that way, or they felt whatever, you're not actually, there's the rule, and I don't think it should necessarily be a rule, but there's the rule that people present that you should show, not tell. And in general, you probably should show, not tell. I wouldn't say get rid of telling everywhere, because it can speed up parts of your book. That if you have to show everything, you're never going to write a book. Let's just say that there's certain cases where you need to skip over parts, where you need to just gloss over it, and that's okay. But if you're trying to convey like deep emotions, and you say, he felt really sad, you're going to be like, the person reading it, it's going to be boring because they don't actually understand that. It goes back to that idea that you're using metaphors. You're using metaphors, and you're using tangible, concrete things to explain, and you need to do that same thing. The same thing goes with think. I think that this is the case, or it's not explaining how, or it's not explaining the depth of the thought. I think that the world is round, the world is flat, whatever. Or you could say, this character thought whatever. Well, you don't have to actually say the character thought something. You can actually just make the character think, right? You can make the character think. You can present what the character is thinking. One thing I like to do is kind of start with a thought, and then you use a paragraph to actually go through the thoughts of the character. Other things, these next ones, the next few are similar to the word really. As, a lot, sort of, kind of, and like, and just. As, a lot, sort of, kind of, like, and just are all just like the word very. I'm sorry. It's like you run into it and then you realize you do it. And I'm as bad as everybody else. I don't generally do it in my writing. Generally, it's probably one of those words you probably shouldn't use, right? They don't convey a specific meaning, and that's why you're being told to avoid it. It's the same thing as really. Another word that you're told not to use is you, right? And the reason, I don't really understand this. I think that you can be used very well in writing. I think it's just a pet peeve that people have. Somebody at some point was like, we shouldn't use the second person singular or plural. We should just use first person, and we should just use third person, and that's it. Now, I think that the word you can be really useful in some cases when you're talking to the reader and you're trying to connect to the reader in a way and trying to bring the reader into the story and present the story as if it really happened. So I actually have an objection to their objection. And then used to. This isn't necessarily ambiguous. I think it's just colloquial. I can't say that word. And then here, okay, so Eleanor Leonard, she said, never open a book with weather. Avoid prologues. Never use a verb other than said to carry the dialogue. Never use an adverb to modify the word said. Now, never use a book to open the weather is the idea of a cliche. So essentially, she's trying to say everybody uses weather to open a book. Everybody uses weather to open a book. You shouldn't do it because you're just copying what everybody else is doing. She's saying avoid prologues because it doesn't get into the story right away. It makes people wait longer. People may be bored, but I think it's also something that maybe she just doesn't like them. I think that they can be very useful for setting up a book. And then she says, never use a verb other than said to carry dialogue. And then never use an adverb to modify the word said. The adverb thing goes back to the meaning. When you use an adverb, it's not as concrete. Okay, so there are reasons why they're saying these things. And then never use a word other than the verb said goes back to the idea of actually writing how people talk. Because if you use words other than said, you kind of get into this bind where you don't sound like an actual person. You sound like somebody trying to sound like an actual person. You sound like a robot or an alien. It's like the Zuckerberg meme, where he's trying to be, or no, it's the Elon Musk meme where he is going on the zip line. And he's saying, oh, do humans like this? And they're like, oh, yeah, people really like this. And he's like, oh, I will like this too. So that's what you sound like. It's like, oh, people blurt things out. Therefore, I will write blurt. Now, I am actually not saying that. I'm not saying that I don't agree with some of these. Actually, I don't agree with them. I agree with them in spirit in some cases. That's why I explained them all to you. But the issue is that they're just presenting rules that don't apply to all cases. And I've said this before, where even though a rule might apply in most cases, if it doesn't apply in all cases, you're kind of tripping people up, right? You should be like, hey, most of the time you probably shouldn't do this. Most of the time you probably shouldn't do that. The rule this week is every writing tool is useful for something. Some are more useful than others. I don't know if I actually said that yet. So every writing tool is useful for something. Some are more useful for others. And that's where my sticking point is. That's my issue. So Kurt Vonnegut, essentially, this is probably the only one in any of these. And I took a very, very small snippet. I took a very small snippet of these rules. And I listed them just to give you an example. This is certainly not the end of them. If you want to look them up, you can find tons of different things people say you shouldn't do in writing. But if the semicolon, that's the only one where I would say, okay, you're right, if the semicolon actually doesn't have meaning. But my issue with this is that my issue with all these rules that I've already presented and other rules that people present, I think that Stepen King hates adverbs too. The problem with it is that there's going to be a case where a writer who is new runs into something where they should use that, or it is the best solution to say, oh, I should use an adverb here, and that's the best way to convey this idea. Or maybe they just don't have the skills to convey it in any other way. Well, if you don't have the skills to convey something any other way, you might as well use a rudimentary way of conveying it, right? And you can learn how to convey it later. So even if you're not the best writer, you shouldn't feel like you're bad at writing. Well, maybe you should feel like you're bad at writing, but you shouldn't feel worried that you're going against these rules. Okay. So I'm probably going to repeat some of this in my cliche rule, but I kind of want to go into it. So I'm just going to go back into these rules, and I'm going to actually talk about why I object to them. I'm skipping over Kurt Vonnegut's rule. He's an interesting thinker in terms of writing. I don't know about everything else, but he does have interesting thoughts in terms of writing generally. So George Orwell says, never use a figure of speech that you are used to seeing in print. Okay, and like I said, this goes back to this idea that you are trying to convey an exact meaning to your readers. And if you use a cliche, people gloss over it. They don't realize what's being talked about. Now, what you need to do is you don't abandon that cliche. What you do is you figure out what that cliche is about, and then you convey that idea. And maybe you use that figure of speech, but you expand on it, right? So you actually go back to the cliche because there's a reason why things are cliches. And because you've actually thought about the cliche, you're able to present it to somebody where they say, oh, never thought about that before. And then I've already explained the never use a long word where a short one will do. I'm actually going to jump down to Eleanor Leonard's then. So she says, never open up a book with weather. This is a cliche. It goes back to that rule that Orwell said. It's not that you can't open up a book with weather. Here's the issue. Everything becomes cliche, right? you aren't making anything new. And I think the faster you learn that, the more fun you can have with writing. You aren't making something new. Everybody is basing what they're writing off something else. And even if you go back to the first stories, they were probably basing it off of just real life. So they weren't basing it off of, it just wasn't coming from their imagination. They were pulling it from somewhere. I really think, and you don't have to agree with me on this, but I really think that writing isn't coming up with something new. Art isn't coming up with something new. It's trying to find a different way to express the same idea. It's trying to find a different way to see the same thing, but it's not, you're not creating something new. Okay. Really that's why we have genres. Each genre is kind of like the exact same thing done over and over and over again. If you watch TV, you'll see that there are specific types of shows. There's first of all, there's like science fiction, which science fiction really isn't a genre. It's really different genres with technology and weird stuff in them. Okay, but my wife and I watched a movie, a film. My wife and I watched a movie about 2 days ago, and then about 3 months ago we watched another movie, and then about 10 years ago, I saw the movie Groundhog's Day with Bill Murray. Now, the movie Groundhog's Day with Bill Murray is where he's stuck in a time loop and he has to keep on repeating everything over and over and over again until he gets it right and he figures stuff out. And he gets really good and he tries to kill himself, etc., all these different things, and he gets stuck. And he gets stuck in this time loop and he eventually becomes a better person. And he everything starts to go his way. And he doesn't take advantage of, I think there's like a girl, and he doesn't take advantage of her at the end. It's not just, it's something more than like physical or anything like that at the end of the movie. Now, about 3 months ago, my wife and I and some friends watched a movie where a guy gets stuck in a time loop, and no, he keeps on going back in time. And he keeps on repeating the same thing over and over again. And I actually thought of another movie that does this. He keeps on repeating the same movie over and over again because he's trying to change the future, because he's trying to get with a girl, because it's a chick flick, and I have to watch chick flicks. No, I don't. But it was all right. No, it was good. It was good. It was more like a romantic comedy. Chick flicks are very specific, and I don't watch them because they're painful. It was a romantic comedy. And he kept on going back and back because he wanted to get with a girl. And the last one we watched, it was a guy stuck in an elevator. And he wasn't stuck in an elevator, but he kept on waking up in an elevator, and he had to repeat his day over and over again, an hour over and over again, and figure stuff out. Now that I think about it, if you remember the butterfly effect, this is the same thing where he keeps on going back in time. He keeps on changing stuff, but it never turns out the way he wants it to. The cool thing about these stories is that they're all very different. They're all very entertaining. They all convey something different. They're all not just they aren't all the same message. They aren't all the same information. Every story has a similar type of pacing because that's the nature of stories, but they aren't all the same at all, besides the basic structure. It's kind of like, think of it like a human. Humans generally look the same, right? If you were an alien coming from another planet, you'd probably be like, oh, all humans look really, really similar. I can't tell them apart. But if you're a human, you realize, oh, there's a lot of different things going on here. There's a lot of different types of people, and I can tell this person from that person. And if you are around a specific type of people, you see it even more. And that's what stories are. Even though they're very similar, even though they're the exact same thing over and over again, and anybody who says, oh, don't use a cliche in a book, I think is being a hypocrite, because every time they're using a story structure, they're essentially using a cliche over, because we know that a story structure fits. Like, people expect certain things at certain times, or they expect a certain amount of pacing, and they expect a certain thing from a story. They expect certain things to happen. They expect a resolution. They expect character change. And all these things have become cliche. But the issue, and this explains, I think, bad movies to a certain degree as well, or bad storytelling in movies. The issue with saying this, I don't remember where I was going. Everything is the same. And the issue with saying that, oh, you shouldn't have a cliche in a book, or you shouldn't start a story with weather, which is a cliche. Starting a story with weather is a cliche. the issue with it is they're using a cliche. They're using this idea used over and over and over again. They're using this structure used over and over and over again to tell a story. But what's different between a good story and what's different between a good story and a bad story? What's different? What's the difference between a cliche that works or one that you use and it fits in the story, or you use it in a way that's great, and one that's bad? Well, that's, I think, thoughtlessness, where you actually don't put in the work to make something good. You aren't saying, oh, well, how can I make this realistic, or how can I really convey this character's emotions? How can I express what's going on in the story, and all these different things, right? And if you actually do that with a regular cliche, you're going to be all right. I'm not going to go over prologues, but I think that's really, I don't know. I think that most of the time when writers, and they're not incorrect in spirit. I just think they're incorrect in what they're saying. And the really weird thing about it is writers, maybe they aren't. Maybe I'm completely misreading every single writer in existence. But like me as a writer, I have to think about stuff a lot, and I have to chew on stuff and try to figure stuff out, and I have to have ideas, and I have to try to dig into ideas really deeply. And I would expect that other writers would do the same, because I don't generally think, oh, like I'm the only writer who does this. I typically think that, oh, writers really think about what they're writing and think about what they're going through, because they're just dealing with thoughts. They're just dealing with abstractions, right? They're just dealing with symbols on paper, essentially. But I would think that if a writer was making a rule, they would actually have a rule that works, and not one that they break themselves with the cliche. So again, this rule this week is every writing tool is useful for something. Some are more useful than others. All right. You're going to run into a lot of advice where somebody says never use things. When you run into a lot of advice where someone never used things, where someone says, if I can actually talk, never use something, instead of saying, oh, they're exactly right, maybe think, maybe they're wrong, but maybe they're verging on, like maybe they're by a right idea. Maybe they are close to an idea that's good. There are certain things that you can use a lot. There are certain things that, like, you have to use the sentence over and over again. You have to use a paragraph structure. You have to use a story. You have to use a story structure over and over again. Or you have to have a structure to your story, because everything that we're conveying that has an idea that people understand has a structure. It's just how life is. If it doesn't have a structure, we don't understand it. And even those things you're like, well, that doesn't have a structure. If you think about it, that thing actually does have a structure for you to understand it. And maybe those things that you say, oh, that doesn't have a structure, maybe you understand it based on a structure, right? So you actually have a structure to understand it. But instead of doing that, remember, okay, there's certain things that I probably should avoid, but I'm not forbidden from using anything. I hate it when people say never use these things. First of all, because the language evolves, the language changes. And second of all, because they are useful in some cases. In some cases, it's good to have an adverb. Maybe you want a character to have an adverb. Maybe it's the best way to write something. I don't know your situation. I don't know what you're writing, but I think that's okay. All right, so I'm going to jump over to the logical fallacy of the week. The logical fallacy is actually a type of equivocation. So what equivocation is using a term in multiple different ways. All right, this is not good, because if you use a term in multiple different ways, you have two different ideas. So if I use the word, what's a synonym? No, not what's a homonym? I can't remember. I have to think of a homonyms. I need a homonym examples. So the word right and right, okay? Now, I don't know how you're going to argue based on something like this, but if I say, oh, if you start, I can't use it because they're completely different parts of speech, but let's just say, we have two ideas of think, all right? So the first idea, and I'm just making this up on the spot. The first idea is what is going on, like the thoughts you have, the actual thoughts, your experience of thinking, okay? That is one thing. Now, the other one is just the chemicals in your brains doing something, right? Now, saying these are the exact same thing, I think, is incorrect. If you use them interchangeably, that's equivocating. You may disagree with me on that, but I think you can understand. We can measure the chemicals in your brain. We can't necessarily measure your experience of what's going on in your head. That's what I mean is the difference between these two things. If we equivocation is where you conflate the two ideas and you use them interchangeably. So you start to talk about something, and I used to be terrible about this, and I probably still am. You start to talk about thinking, and you say, oh yeah, like thinking, like we can measure thinking, et cetera, and then you start to switch it over to talking about the actual experience of thinking that a person has. So equivocation is using two ideas that have the same term, and you're using them interchangeably, which is not a good thing. Now, the specific type of equivocation it's called definitional retreat. So what it is similar. It reminds me of moving the goalposts. And moving the goalposts, if you remember, is you have an argument and then somebody has an objection. So you change what your argument is and you keep on moving. Oh, but we're trying to meet this, whatever. But definitional retreat is where you're changing the meaning of a word to deal with something that's like an objection somebody has against your original wording. Okay. So somebody says, oh, but like, but I think that maybe they argue against our idea of thinking. Maybe they say, but like thinking is, you start to talk about thinking as if it's chemicals, and you say, oh, we see thinking and we're measuring it here. And then someone says, oh, but thinking is more than just chemicals, yada, yada, yada. And they say, yeah, what's going on in our heads. And you're like, oh yeah, that's what it is as well. So you're actually changing the definition of what you had originally to try to meet that objection. All right. So I felt like I talked a lot about different objections, and I hope that you understand. I hope it actually cements this idea in your head of every writing tool is useful for something, but some are more useful than others. I hope that idea is cemented in your head. But I did talk about just the objections a lot. You should know that these objections probably have thought behind them. I certainly do. Just remember that every writer doesn't have all the information of everything in existence. So, all right, that's all I've got for you this week. As always, my name is Daniel Poppy, and this is How to Write Good.